Picture this. Shanghai, 1931. A packed auditorium, thousands of people pressing in from every direction, standing in the aisles, crowding the doorways, spilling out into the street. Some have walked for hours, some have been carried on stretchers. A young man takes the stage, barely 30 years old, slight in frame, his suit hanging loose on his shoulders. He opens his mouth and the room goes absolutely still. He preaches for 3 hours without notes. People weep without knowing why. A woman who hadn't walked in 6 years stands up from the back of the room. A man who came in talks, converted, undone, changed. Night after night, week after week, city after city across China, the same thing happens. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. His name is John Sung, and by the time he died, at 39 years old, his body destroyed by disease, his strength utterly spent, China would never be the same. But here's what almost no one knows about this man who shook an entire continent. He almost didn't make it out of a psychiatric institution. For 6 months, in a small room in America, a man who would one day ignite one of the greatest revivals in Asian history sat locked in a ward with patients who had lost their minds. He sat there by choice, not because he had lost his, but because he had found something so consuming, so total, that the world outside those walls had no idea what to do with him. This is the story of a boy who was raised to be a scholar, driven to be a scientist, broken by ambition, and then reconstructed entirely from the inside out into something the world had never seen before. A story of a brilliant mind surrendered completely to God. A story of fire that could not be contained, and a life that burned so brightly it was spent before most men find their footing. Are you ready? He was born in 1901 in the Fujian province of southeastern China, the 6th child of a Methodist minister named Sung Xuelian. The family was poor in the way that rural Chinese pastors were poor, not starving, but perpetually stretched, perpetually dependent on the generosity of a small congregation that itself had very little. His father's church sat at the edge of a small village, and John grew up watching his father preach to farmers and fishermen, week after week, year after year, in a building with a leaky roof and no heating. His father, everyone called him Pastor Sung, was not a complicated man. He had no theological degrees, no impressive credentials. He had simply given his life over to God in his youth, and never taken it back. He prayed for hours each morning. He fasted regularly. He visited the sick and the poor without keeping track of how many times. His children watched all of this without fully understanding it. John was different from his siblings from the start. Restless, hungry, reading everything he could find, absorbing mathematics and science with a speed that startled his teachers. By the time he was a teenager, the entire village already knew. This boy was going somewhere, and his father knew it too. But the elder Sung believed his son was going somewhere specific. He believed John was called to preach, called to ministry, called to follow in his father's footsteps. He told John this often. He prayed over him. He laid his hands on his young son's head and spoke blessing after blessing into him. John heard it all, and he filed it away, because what John Sung wanted, what burned in him far more urgently than any sense of calling, was to understand how the world worked, not spiritually, scientifically. He wanted to go to America. He wanted a laboratory and a microscope, and a degree from a real university. He wanted to prove that a boy from a Fujian village could stand at the highest table of Western science. In 1920, at 19 years old, he got on a boat. He carried almost nothing with him, a small allowance, a few letters of introduction, and a hunger so intense it barely registered as anything other than ordinary ambition. He enrolled at Ohio Wesleyan University, then Ohio State, eventually landing at Ohio State's chemistry department, where he threw himself into his studies with an intensity that unnerved his professors. He graduated in 3 years. 3. He earned his doctorate in chemistry at 25 years old. When he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, the university gave him a gold medal, the highest academic honor it could bestow. He stood there in Ohio sunshine, a Chinese pastor's son holding a gold medal, and the world seemed to open up before him. He had done it. He had proved what he set out to prove. He had arrived. But standing there at the summit he'd spent 5 years climbing, John Sung felt something strange, something he hadn't expected. He felt nothing, not happiness, not satisfaction, not relief. The gold medal was real and heavy in his hand, and it meant absolutely nothing. He had accomplished exactly what he set out to accomplish, and it had left him emptier than when he started. He was 25 years old and already disillusioned with the great prize he had chased across an ocean. That same year, 1927, John enrolled at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He wasn't sure why, maybe because his father's voice was still somewhere inside him. Maybe because he had run out of other directions to turn. He walked into Union Theological expecting to find the God his father had always talked about, expecting some kind of spiritual ignition to match the intellectual fire that had driven him through graduate school. What he found instead appalled him. Union Theological Seminary in the 1920s was a bastion of liberal theology. Professors questioned the literal resurrection. The virgin birth was treated as metaphor. The miracles of Jesus were discussed as literary devices. John sat in lecture after lecture, listening to men in suits dismantle every fundamental belief his father had ever held, and dress the dismantling up in very impressive academic language. His father prayed for hours each morning in a leaky church in Fujian. These professors published papers arguing that prayer was largely psychological. His father had wept over the lost and the suffering his entire life. These professors analyzed suffering through the lens of social theory. John was not angry. He was something worse. He was spiritually starving in a room full of people who had traded their hunger for credentials. But then something happened, something he had not planned and could not have predicted. In February of 1927, John attended a revival meeting at a local church. Nothing extraordinary by outward appearances. A simple gathering, a preacher, a crowd of ordinary people. But during that meeting, something broke open inside him. He later described what happened as impossible to fully put into words. He said it was like a fire that started somewhere in his chest and moved outward until it consumed everything. He wept for hours. He couldn't stop. He wasn't performing grief. He was experiencing something that had no name he could reach for. Later he would call it the moment he actually met the God his father had always talked about. The moment the intellectual concept of Jesus became a living, undeniable reality. He walked back to his dormitory changed. But what happened next is where the story gets complicated. John Sung did not ease quietly back into seminary life, slightly warmer toward God and slightly more open to spiritual things. That is not what happened. What happened is that John Sung was set on fire, and fire does not behave quietly. He began preaching in the dormitory halls. He interrupted lectures to declare that the professors were teaching lies. He stood up in chapel and told the gathered seminary students that most of what they were being taught was spiritually dead. He gave away his belongings. He fasted for days. He carried his Bible everywhere and read it with a ferocity that alarmed everyone around him. The faculty called it a breakdown. Within weeks, John Sung was committed to Bloomingdale Psychiatric Hospital in New York. He was 26 years old. He had a gold medal in chemistry and a doctorate from Ohio State, and now he was being led through a locked door in upstate New York. He stayed for 193 days. And here is what is remarkable, what is almost unbearable to sit with. John Sung did not spend those 193 days trying to convince anyone he was sane. He did not argue his case or attempt to negotiate his way out. He read his Bible. He prayed. He read through the entire New Testament, cover to cover, over 40 times. He prayed for the other patients by name. He sang hymns quietly in his room at night. He later said those 193 days were not a detour from his calling. They were the training ground for it. A man who understood suffering could speak to the suffering. A man who had sat in a locked room with the broken and the discarded could walk into the poorest villages of China and be immediately trusted. A man who had hit the absolute floor of what human dignity looks like, stripped of his degrees, his reputation, his freedom, his credibility, had nothing left to prove to anyone. When John Sung walked out of in the fall of 1927, he was not the same man who walked in. He also threw his gold medal into the sea on the ship home. He never mentioned it again. He arrived back in China in late 1927 to a father who had prayed for him every day. Pastor Sung wept when he saw his son. John wept too. There was a lot between them that didn't need to be said aloud. But China was not easy territory for revival. The late 1920s were a time of extraordinary political instability. Warlords, nationalists, communists, Japanese pressure building on every border. Most people were consumed with physical survival. The church was there, but it was largely quiet, largely institutional, largely unthreatening to anyone. John Sung walked into it like a torch. He began preaching wherever anyone would have him. Small churches, street corners, schoolrooms. He preached with an intensity that made comfortable people deeply uncomfortable, and that made desperate people feel, for the first time, that someone understood exactly how desperate they were. He talked about sin with a directness that made pastors shift in their seats. He talked about the Holy Spirit in a way that made theologians nervous. He talked about healing and prayer and the power of God with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who had seen these things happen, not the careful hedging of a man who had only read about them. And then the unusual things started. During his services, simple, ordinary services with no theatrical staging, people began reporting healings, not one or two isolated cases, dozens, then hundreds over the years. A woman with tuberculosis who recovered when it made no medical sense. A man with a growth that disappeared before a follow-up examination. Paralytics who moved. The deaf who heard. John Sung's response to every one of these reports was the same. He deflected, always. He pointed upward, always. "I have no power," he said. "None. I am nothing. This is God." He sometimes seemed almost irritated when people focused on the healings rather than on repentance. The miracles were not the point, he insisted. The point was the state of the soul. By the early 1930s, his ministry had expanded far beyond any single city or province. He traveled with an evangelistic team he called the Bethel Band, a group of young believers who fanned out across China, into Southeast Asia, into Malaysia and Singapore and the Philippines, preaching with the same ferocious urgency that characterized everything John Sung did. Singapore, 1935. 4,000 people packed into a hall built for half that many. 10,000 over the course of a week. Conversions that the local churches spent the following decade trying to disciple. A revival that people who were there would describe to their grandchildren decades later as the most powerful thing they had ever witnessed. He was 34 years old. But the body was already beginning to fail. John Sung drove himself the way a man drives a machine that doesn't belong to him, with no particular concern for preservation. He fasted constantly. He preached multiple services a day. He wrote letters, met with individuals, counseled the broken, prayed with the sick, traveled through tropical heat and disease and political chaos, and then got up the next morning and did it again. His wife, a quiet, steady woman he had married in the early 1930s, watched this with the particular anguish of someone who loves a person who is clearly burning faster than they should. She asked him to slow down. His colleagues asked him to slow down. His body eventually stopped asking and started simply failing. In 1940, doctors discovered tuberculosis of the intestines. He had been unwell for longer than he had admitted to anyone. Surgery followed. Recovery was slow. The war was spreading. Japanese forces controlled large parts of China by then, and travel had become dangerous in new and urgent ways. John Sung was not well enough to preach the way he had preached, but he preached anyway. Sitting down when he could no longer stand, receiving visitors in his sick room when he could no longer travel, writing letters when he could no longer receive visitors, praying without ceasing in a way that can only be understood by someone who believes, with total and uncomplicated certainty, that prayer is not symbolic. In 1944, a visitor sat with him in his sick room and asked him if he had any regrets. John Sung thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "The only thing I regret is the time I wasted before I knew what I was supposed to be doing." He died on August 18, 1944. He was 42 years old. At his bedside were his wife and his father, the old Methodist pastor from Fujian, who had laid his hands on his son's head decades earlier and spoken blessing into him. He had been right all along, the old man. He had simply not been able to foresee the shape that blessing would take. The locked hospital room, the gold medal at the bottom of the sea, the burning years and the worn-out body, and the hundreds of thousands of people across Asia who would spend the rest of their lives pointing to a single encounter with John Sung as the moment everything changed for them. Across China, across Malaysia, across Singapore and the Philippines and Indonesia, people wept when the news came. Churches held prayer services. Pastors stood at their pulpits and tried to find words. Scholars who have studied the history of Christianity in Asia estimate that John Sung's ministry, in roughly 15 years of active work, produced more lasting fruit than almost any other figure in the 20th century history of the church in East Asia. He was buried simply. He had no gold medal to bury with him. Today, the churches that were planted by converts from his meetings, churches that then planted other churches, that then planted others, form a network so large and so interwoven into the fabric of Asian Christianity that it is almost impossible to trace the full shape of it. The movement he helped ignite in Singapore alone has been called the foundation of modern evangelical Christianity in Southeast Asia. He was not perfect. People who traveled with him noted that he could be difficult, demanding, impatient with what he considered spiritual laziness. He had little patience for theological nicety when he believed souls were at stake. Some people found him abrasive. Some left his meetings deeply challenged in ways that were uncomfortable, rather than immediately warm. He would have considered none of that a problem, because John Sung had learned something in a locked room in upstate New York that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. He had learned what it costs to be genuinely surrendered. Not surrendered as a concept, not surrendered as a Sunday morning aspiration, but surrendered in the absolute, total, irreversible sense, where you throw the gold medal into the ocean and you don't look back. He had learned that there is a price for carrying something real, that the anointing, whatever you want to call it, whatever framework you use to understand what happened in those packed halls in Shanghai and Singapore, does not come without cost. It comes through the fire of it, through the loss of it, through the years in the locked room, and the illness and the body spent faster than it should have been, and the choice made over and over to keep going anyway. Catherine Kuhlman gave up a marriage. John Sung gave up a career, a reputation, a future in Western science that could have been genuinely extraordinary. And God used both of them, this mid-century American woman in white gowns and this slight Chinese chemist with a worn-out Bible, to move in ways that neither of them could have orchestrated on their own. Which raises the question that John Sung himself raised, in every service, in every city, in every language in which his message was eventually translated and repeated. What are you holding on to? What is the thing that you know, somewhere under the surface of your everyday life, that you are not willing to hand over? What is your gold medal? What is your wall trip? What is the thing you keep telling yourself you can have and still have the rest? The calling, the power, the life that actually means something. John Sung would not let you answer that question vaguely. He had no patience for vague. He would want you to name it, and then he would tell you, with the absolute certainty of a man who had tested this at the cost of everything he had. The moment you hand it over is the moment everything changes. Comment below. Are you willing to pay the price? If you are ready to surrender what you're holding back, let us know by leaving "I am surrendered" in the comments. And tell us, who would you like us to cover next on Circle of Believers? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. These are the lives that prove what becomes possible when a human being stops holding back. If John Sung's surrender ignited a continent, what happened when a former slave trader fell to his knees and wrote the words that would become the most recognized hymn in the English language? What did John Newton lose before he found what he was looking for? And how did one broken man's confession of grace change the way the world thinks about redemption? That story is next. Don't miss it.